Welcome to the nuts and bolts of STAAR A. This training will give you an overview of STAAR A new assessment for 2015. The available assessments we have in 2015 are STAAR, STAAR A, which is a new assessment, STAAR Alternate 2, which is also a new assessment, TELPAS, and TAX. There are some new assessments and changes. However, everything that you already know about state assessment is good through December of 2014. So all of our state testing that we've prepared for goes through the end of this school year. Any updates to the accommodation triangle and the new assessments will occur for the first time in the spring of 2015. The information contained in this training is to help you prepare for the spring of 2015 testing. Students should be administered the STAAR assessments that align to the level of TEKS instruction that they are receiving, regardless of their enrolled grade level. Last year, TEA applied for a waiver from the USDE regarding double testing of middle school students who are taking EOC courses. That waiver was denied. In 2014, we did not double test. What does the denied waiver mean for 2015? Stay tuned. We're still waiting for more information. Standardized Oral Administration, otherwise known as SOA, for the STAAR program is an online option for oral administration. It will be expanded in the 2014-2015 school year to include Grade 5 Science and Grade 6 Reading and Mathematics assessments. Campuses will be able to test students using SOA for STAAR in the following grades and subjects. Revised TEKS and mathematics were adopted by the SBOE in April of 2012. In the 2014-2015 school year, the revised TEKS for grades K through 8 will be implemented in classroom instruction and therefore in the STAAR mathematics assessments at grades 3 through 8. Based on the revisions to the TEKS and subsequently to the STAAR assessments, new performance standards for STAAR grades 3 through 8 mathematics will be set in the summer of 2015. Students who participate in the spring 2015 STAAR grades 3 through 8 mathematics administrations will receive a raw score prior to the end of the year. Once new performance standards are approved, they will be retroactively applied to the students' test results from the spring 2015 administrations. New reports and data files will be sent to the school district in August of 2015. Also new this year, beginning in the 2014-2015 school year, districts must ensure that each student has a handheld graphing calculator to use when taking the STAAR Grade 8 mathematics assessment. This is the same accommodation triangle that TEA had in place for the 2014 state assessment program. The only changes made to the accommodation triangle has to do with some eligibility criteria for 504 students. 504 students now have access to some new accommodations that they did not previously have access to. Other than that, everything on the accommodations triangle has remained the same. There was an update made in the eligibility criteria for an oral administration. Any student who receives special education services or receives Section 504 services as a student identified with dyslexia or a related disorder may use this accommodation if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. And that basically means that a student must routinely, independently, and effectively use this accommodation. The main thing that was changed with oral administration is that TEA tried to define in the examples and types if a student needed to qualify for oral administration or if the student receives text-to-speech as a function of the test that they are taking. So for STAAR L and STAAR A, text-to-speech is a function of the test. So students didn't have to qualify for an oral administration in order to be able to take STAAR L and STAAR A. Also for SOA, the standardized oral administration, the student has to be eligible for an oral administration. The paperwork from the ARG committee or 504 does not need to state SOA or standardized oral administration. If an ARG committee or 504 committee determines that the student needs an oral entirety, meaning that everything eligible to be read on the test must be read orally, then SOA would not be appropriate. This information is taken from the accommodation triangle with regards to oral administration. This is where TEA tried to define the text-to-speech function for STAAR L as well as the text-to-speech function in STAAR A. TEA made one little update in the eligibility for mathematics manipulatives. They have added that students who receive Section 504 services as a student identified with dyslexia or a related disorder may use this accommodation if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. All of the eligibility criteria did remain the same from the 2014 school year. Just like for math manipulatives on supplemental aids, TEA added that students receiving Section 504 services as identified with dyslexia or a related disorder may use this accommodation if he or she meets the eligibility criteria. All of the remaining eligibility criteria remain the same as the 2014 testing calendar year. The only change that was made here for calculation devices is that TEA left grades 5 through 8 for the eligibility criteria, and you may be wondering, well, why is grade 8 still listed since we now have to provide a calculator for the 8th grade math test? TEA left grade 8 on here because you may have a student who needs to qualify for a calculator for the science test. Other than that, no changes were made to calculation devices. For students who need a Type 2 accommodation, there is an accommodation request form that must be submitted to TEA. Those may be submitted starting in January of 2015. As we know, STAAR Modified has been discontinued as a state assessment option. STAAR A and STAAR Alternate 2 are new assessments for this school year, and all allowable procedures and materials are the same as in the 2014 assessment year. We are excited about STAAR A. STAAR A is a new assessment, and it's not anything like Tax A was from a few years ago. The STAAR A assessment is online, but let our district technology department worry about the hardware needed to test students. Go to the tutorials available online in a practice test and take them before you make up your mind about this assessment. We think that you're going to see what a great thing this test is for our students. STAAR A will be treated like STAAR for accountability, so there is no downside for students taking this assessment. You may remember that previously we had a cap on the number of students who are allowed to take STAAR Modified. There is no cap for STAAR A. So we're going to try to briefly cover what you need to know about STAAR A in the next slide. STAAR A is an accommodated online version of STAAR for students who meet eligibility requirements. STAAR A will be administered for the first time in spring of 2015, and it's administered at all of the regular STAAR grade levels and EOC subjects. STAAR A will be administered online and will include online tools, embedded accommodations to selections and test questions, and accessibility features. The embedded accommodations and accessibility features highlighted in green are ones that were specifically developed for the STAAR A assessment. The tools, which have an asterisk beside them, those tools are subject-specific and only appear in subject tests where they are relevant. So how are STAAR and STAAR A in comparison to each other? Well, they are the same in several ways. They have the same passing standards, the same time limits, the same assessed curriculum, the same test blueprints, and the same progress measures. The way that they are different is that STAAR A has no field test questions. It can only be administered online, and STAAR A has embedded accommodations and accessibility features which STAAR does not have. So how do we decide which state assessment a student needs to take? You should always look at STAAR first. STAAR, with or without allowable or approved accommodations, should be the first consideration in an ARD or a 504 committee meeting. In order to determine which accommodations could be approved, refer to the 2015 accommodation triangle. Once an ARD committee or a 504 committee has looked at STAAR as the assessment, if the student cannot access STAAR with or without allowable accommodations, he or she must be receiving the following services in order to consider STAAR A. Students identified with disabilities who are receiving special education services, or students identified with dyslexia or a related disorder and are receiving Section 504 services. If a student falls into one of these categories and receives accommodations and instruction similar to those found in STAAR A, the STAAR A eligibility requirement should be reviewed by the ARD or 504 committee. Additional eligibility criteria found in this document must be met in order for a student to take STAAR A. There is a required documentation form for STAAR A. School districts are required to follow the procedures specified in the test administration materials. As a result, the ARD, or Section 504 committee, in conjunction with the LPAC if the student is an ELL, must use the required documentation form to document eligibility for STAAR A. A student may take STAAR in some subjects and STAAR A in other subjects, depending on eligibility. This is the required documentation form. In Step 1, the committee must indicate eligible services. In Step 2, the committee must review the eligibility criteria. And in Step 3, the committee must summarize the assessment decisions made. In Step 2, when the committee reviews the eligibility requirements, the committee must go through and check off the accommodations the student is currently receiving. To be eligible to participate in STAAR A in a particular subject, 2 or more of the accommodations must be checked in that subject. If fewer than 2 accommodations or the student is not eligible to participate in STAAR A in that subject. We're now going to go over some of the features of STAAR A. The first one is text-to-speech. This is audio provided through a computer-generated read-aloud, which highlights words as they are read. It includes pre-reading text, revising selections, mathematics, reading, science, social studies, and revising test questions. It reads aloud individual words, lines of text, or entire pages at the student's choice. Pop-ups and rollovers are an embedded feature for this test, and they are not read aloud. The test administrator will need to read these aloud if a student asks. A Do Not Read icon has been placed on reading selections, editing selections, and editing test questions to indicate that these may not be read aloud by the text-to-speech feature or a test administrator. Pop-ups and rollovers associated with any of these pages may not be read aloud either. Zoom is another feature. This enlarges or reduces the size of the screen. When the screen is increased in size, the student can use the Drag Screen button to move and view any portion of the screen. Another accessibility feature is color and contrast. The student can select from 6 different presentation formats. These include negative, blue backgrounds, yellow backgrounds, purple backgrounds, green overlay, and peach overlay. The format that the student chooses will apply to the screen for the entire test. The student may change the selection or turn it off at any time by clicking on the Reset. Reset changes the presentation back to the original white background with black text. Another accessibility feature is a place marker. A place marker helps a student focus attention on a specific line of text. The student can move a yellow line up and down the screen as they read. Some of the embedded accommodations are pop-ups, rollovers, and exhibit windows. Pop-ups provide support for non-tested words and concepts. These are definitions, synonyms, examples, formulas, plain language, pictures, animations, graphic organizers, etc. Rollovers reword or clarify larger portions of text or provide bulleted steps in a process, and there are also exhibit windows. The exhibit windows are subject-specific graphic organizers and checklists that may be accessed if needed. These are more specific examples of what a pop-up does. A pop-up can define or clarify, construct irrelevant words, phrases, and sentences using plain language, synonyms, definitions, examples, and consistent language. It can provide a visual representation of selection, question, answer choices, or in the writing prompt by adding graphics, photos, or animations. They can also isolate specific information in a question that corresponds to each answer choice. and they can isolate specific text in a selection or information in a graphic or list that is referenced in the questions or answer choices. More examples of pop-ups. They can apply an allowable supplemental aid such as a graphic organizer, place value chart, T-chart, graphic of scientific concept, timeline, map to specific questions or answer choices. It can include the formula from the grade-specific reference material when the question specifies the measure or conversion to be performed. It can direct student attention to parts of the grade-specific reference materials. It can provide clarifying information for a graphic organizer, political cartoon, or a map. And it can also provide scaffolded instructions for responding to short answer questions in English 1 and English 2. Rollovers reword complex questions, answer choices, or box text in a selection to condense text. Rollovers can also bullet or separate steps in a process, such as a multi-step problem or sequence of events. There are also exhibit windows, and the exhibit windows commonly use blank graphic organizers, and they can also be a writing checklist for the writing prompts. For students who meet the eligibility criteria for spelling assistance, STAAR A does not have a spell check feature. So for students who require spelling assistance, they will need to have access to 2 computers. One computer will be used to record responses for STAAR A, and the other computer may be used for spelling assistance. I think you can tell that accommodations used on STAAR A offer new opportunities for students with disabilities to meaningfully access the required state assessment. TEA accommodation policies and STAAR A eligibility requirements indicate that accommodations documented for use during a statewide assessment should be made on an individual basis, consider the needs for the student, and be routinely used during classroom instruction and testing. Although students will not routinely use the computer-based STAAR A accommodations during classroom instruction, they may use variations of the accommodations. I'm now going to go through a few classroom accommodations and show you how it's related to the embedded STAAR A accommodations. So here's an example of a classroom accommodation. The teacher introduces a new book to a struggling reader prior to reading it aloud or independent reading. The topics that they might discuss may include major concepts, difficult words, setting, characters, or prior knowledge of subjects. For the STAAR A eligibility criteria, the teacher would check off preview text before reading to activate prior knowledge, draw conclusions, and set a purpose for reading. The day of the actual STAAR A test, the way that this is embedded is there is a pre-reading text embedded in the test itself. Here's another example of a classroom accommodation. The student uses a dictionary or thesaurus. Another example of an accommodation is using a dictionary or thesaurus. The teacher points out the meaning or synonym of a word. On the actual STAAR A eligibility form, the teacher would check off clarification or rewording of vocabulary, complex sentences and concepts using definitions, similes, literal language, graphics, animations, etc. The way that this is embedded, the student has some text which is underlined with the blue dots, and when the student clicks on the word with the blue dots, a pop-up appears where it says the actual definition of the word. Here's another example of a classroom accommodation. The teacher provides visual aids to define vocabulary, identify people and places, or illustrates concepts. The teacher would check off on the STAAR A eligibility documentation form clarification or rewording of vocabulary, complex sentences, and concepts using definitions, similes, literal language, graphics, animations, etc. Here's an example where students can click on the words that are underlined with the blue dots and a picture appears. So for here on water cycle, the student clicks on water cycle and an actual picture of the water cycle appears. Here's another example of a classroom accommodation. During classroom discussions, the teacher clarifies or rewords complex text or questions. The STAAR A eligibility criteria the teacher would check off on the documentation form It is clarification or rewording of vocabulary, complex sentences, and concepts using definitions, similes, literal language, graphics, animations, etc. For this example of the political cartoon, the student could click to get some additional information about that cartoon, as well as clicking on words that are underlined with a blue dot, just to get some clarifying or more simplistic language for those questions. For this classroom accommodation, the teacher isolates specific information to focus the student on the core concept being taught. For the STAAR A eligibility criteria the teacher would select, it is to direct student attention to specific information, for example, parts of the selection, parts of a graphic, parts of an answer choice. The way that that is embedded is, for this question, the student is having to improve the clarity of sentence 23, and the student is being asked to select to clarify with either using the words my house or the food. When the student clicks on my house, the entire sentence pops up with the new words in there to clarify the sentence. Here's another example of a classroom accommodation. The teacher directs the student to the specific part of the selection, diagram, map, or figure that's being discussed. For the STAAR A eligibility, it simply says direct student attention to specific information. When the student clicks on the underlined word or words with a blue dot, the information becomes bolded in this figure. So if the student clicks on line segment KS, then KS becomes bolded. The student clicks on line segment LM, then LM becomes bolded. So it just stands out. Here's another example for paragraph 6. If the student clicks on figurative language, then the figurative language from paragraph 6 pops up in a box. Here's another example of a classroom accommodation. The teacher asks guiding questions, prompting the student to go back to the text to justify his or her understanding of plot, conflict, resolution, character development, etc. On the STAAR A eligibility form, the teacher would check off scaffold understanding of open-ended questions about text. Here's an example of an embedded STAAR A accommodation. In this question, the student can check on the blue box, and when they click on the blue box, this pop-up appears. These are steps the student can take which helps them to better answer the question. Here is another example of a classroom accommodation. The teacher reformats complex word problems by bulleting or spacing out each step required to solve the problem. On the STAAR A eligibility form, the teacher would check scaffold steps in a process. Here, as an embedded accommodation, the student can click on the blue box, and when they click on the blue box, bulleted items appear, which will help the student answer the question. This is another example of scaffolding steps in a process. When the student clicks on the blue box within the text, a pop-up appears with more information. Here is another example of a classroom accommodation. The teacher provides the student with specific supplemental aid applicable to the question being posed, the assignment, or task. On the STAAR A eligibility form, the teacher would check off use of generic and question-specific graphic organizers and checklists. You can see here that when a student clicks on the information underlined in blue, a graphic organizer appears. This is the last example I'm going to show you of how a classroom accommodation can be embedded in STAAR A. For this example, the teacher provides the formula needed to solve the problem. For STAAR A eligibility, the teacher would check off identification of formula to use with specific questions. For the example here for how this is embedded in STAAR A, when the student clicks on fluid ounces, which is underlined with the blue dots, a pop-up appears which includes the relevant formulas from the reference chart. These are special situations which ARD committees and 504 committees may have to consider based on the student. Because STAAR A contains embedded accommodations and accessibility features presented in an online format, replacing these features in a paper or a Braille version is not always possible. Technology-based accommodations enable most of our students to be able to test online. When the use of an accommodation is not feasible or appropriate, or if the administration of an online test is inappropriate due to a student's particular disability, a special request may be made to TEA for approval to administer a paper test booklet. The paper administration request document can be found on the Coordinator Manual Resources webpage. Remember that not all embedded accommodations for STAAR A online will be translated over to a paper test. Braille versions of STAAR A will not be made available. STAAR A will only be offered in English, so a Spanish version is not available. Also, for students who are deaf or hard of hearing and cannot access the text-to-speech function, assigned administration is allowed for those parts of the test that can be read aloud. A student does not have to be eligible for an oral administration to receive assigned administration of STAAR A, and as always, the test administrator should read the specific guidelines for signing a test. Once testing is over, you may wonder, what do the test results look like? Well, there will be STAAR A score reports, and those reports will include the individual performance level of students, scaled scores, and number of questions answered correctly within each reporting category. For grades 3 through 8, there is an English and Spanish brochure called Understanding the Confidential Student Report, which will explain STAAR A results to parents. For the EOC, the explanation for STAAR A is included in the Confidential Student Report. All of the resources listed here are available on the website listed below at www.texasassessment.com/STAAR A. These are all great resources for parents and educators who want to learn more about STAAR A. There's always a few frequently asked questions, and we're going to try to cover those here. How does SSI apply to students taking STAAR A? For the 2014-2015 school year only, SSI retest and promotion requirements only apply to the reading assessment on STAAR, STAAR Spanish, and STAAR A. It does not apply to mathematics at grades 5 or 8 in the 2014-2015 school year. Information about retest requirements for students receiving special education services who do not meet the standard on the first administration, well, that information has yet to be determined, so stay tuned for more information. What are the graduation requirements for students taking STAAR A? For students receiving Section 504 services, students are required to meet all curriculum requirements and pass all 5 EOC assessments in order to receive a Texas high school diploma. For students receiving special education services, the ARD committee makes educational decisions for a student, including whether satisfactory performance on an EOC assessment shall also be required for graduation. The proposed revisions to this rule, and this is for graduation requirements for students receiving special education services graduating on the Foundation High School program, have not been finalized as of September of 2014. What are the graduation requirements for students receiving special education services who are graduating on the minimum, the recommended, or the distinguished achievement program? Students must meet all curriculum requirements and pass all 5 EOC general assessments, those are STAAR or STAAR A, in order to graduate on the recommended or the distinguished program. The minimum high school program is the only option if the student did not meet the standard on at least one EOC general assessment and the ARD committee determined that no retesting is necessary, or if the student took at least one STAAR modified EOC assessment. Are the modified high school PEIMS codes still applicable? The modified PEIMS codes will apply to the 2014-2015 school year. If changes are made to the codes, they will not be effective until next school year. However, the modified PEIMS codes are no longer associated with a state assessment. A student receiving special education services may be taking a course that has a modified PEIMS code, however, that is not a requirement to take STAAR A. In fact, modified PEIMS codes do not apply to students served only under Section 504. If a student fails a STAAR A EOC, is he or she required to continue testing until he or she passes? For students receiving Section 504 services, students are required to pass all 5 EOC assessments in order to receive a high school diploma, so he or she would need to continue testing until they pass. For students receiving special education services, the ARD committee makes educational decisions for a student, including whether satisfactory performance on an EOC shall also be required for graduation. What if my campus does not have enough computers to administer STAAR A? What if my students are not proficient using a computer? Campuses should plan for STAAR A online administrations prior to the test dates. TEA recommends that teachers become familiar with STAAR A and help guide students through practice selections and test questions until they are comfortable with the STAAR A online testing interface and accommodations.
I have a student who uses a large print test book but is embarrassed testing because the STAAR test book is so big. Since STAAR A has a Zoom feature which would be great for him, can he take STAAR A? This is a great question. The committee would have to determine if he is routinely receiving at least 2 accommodations per subject, which are listed on the STAAR A documentation form. If he was, and he met eligibility for STAAR A, then STAAR A would be appropriate. But if the student is only receiving large print and no other accommodations, the student would take STAAR. He would not meet the eligibility requirements for STAAR A. Remember, STAAR with or without accommodations always has to be the first consideration. I'm now going to review some topics for administrative planning. The first one has to do with small groups. In the past, most students with accommodations for state assessment also had small group listed as an optional testing procedure. Some of our campuses actually have more small groups than regular testing rooms. When it comes to STAAR A, the committee needs to consider, does the student really need a small group? It shouldn't be an automatic procedure just because the student is receiving STAAR A. We have found that students wearing headphones taking online tests are typically focused and engaged with testing on the computer. The headphones block out noise, and the dividers placed around the computer monitor blocks out motion and activity in the room. Something to consider is that if an ARD or 504 committee decides that a student needs STAAR A in a small group, or even as an individual administration, do you have enough computers outside of your computer labs available for those administrations?
Online testing with accommodations like STAAR A, SOA, STAAR L is the future of state testing. Please approach the new online test with an open mind. This is a new generation of online testing that is good for students. STAAR A puts the student in the driver's seat for state testing and allows the student to be an independent tester, which is what all educators want students to be able to do. When the decision is made by the appropriate group that a student is eligible to take the STAAR A test online, the student gets access to all of the accommodations that are available online, such as an oral administration. There is not a way to block the student from accessing accommodations offered in STAAR A. They have access to it all. That's a good thing, as students will use what they need during the state assessment. If a student needs oral entirety, meaning that every word must be read orally, STAAR, not STAAR A, must be given. STAAR A is not appropriate because we can't make TestNav read everything. The student has control over what will and what will not be read orally. A student can choose to have a word, a phrase, a sentence, a passage read to them. So we can't dictate that every single thing must be read. Therefore, if a committee determines that everything must be read, the student would be eligible for STAAR. The STAAR A tutorial and practice test will be posted soon. It is imperative that students being considered for STAAR A be exposed to the tutorials and practice tests online. The tutorials are designed to be administered in a proctored setting. Teachers should be familiar with the directions prior to administering the tutorial. the tutorial directions are designed to take into account the limited, if any, experience that some students may have with standardized testing in an online format. A few items to remember about STAAR A. There is no Spanish version. There is not a Braille version. iPads and tablets cannot be used with online testing. You must use a required documentation form for both 504 and special ed students, and think outside the box when planning online testing this year. Where can I find information about STAAR A? The best place is to go to the website, texasassessment.com/STAAR A. We've also posted links and resources in this e-course. If you have questions about STAAR A that we haven't covered, please email us at star@umble.k12.tx.us.